The sun was just rising as Hannah tightened the saddle on Storm, her chestnut-colored horse with sharp, intelligent eyes. The wind carried the scent of dry grass across the vast Texas plains, and the open road stretched endlessly before her. In her hands, she held a crumpled map, tracing the route her father had dreamed of taking before he fell ill. His memory was still vivid. His worn leather boots, his deep voice speaking of the old cowboy trails, and the hope that sparkled in his eyes. Now, it was up to her to finish what he had started. Hannah had never traveled alone before. At 19, she had always lived under the protective watch of her mother, who had begged her to abandon this idea. "This won't bring your father back, Hannah," her mother had said, gripping her hands tightly. But the grief had become unbearable, and Hannah knew the only way forward was through the journey her father never got to take. Every mile she rode would be a tribute to him, a way to feel like he was still riding beside her. With only the essentials packed and a heavy heart, she left without looking back. The first few miles were quiet, the rhythmic sound of Storm's hoofs tapping against the warm pavement. Hannah stuck to back roads, avoiding highways, feeling a mix of freedom and uncertainty. The sky stretched wide above her, but the vastness of the journey ahead began to weigh on her. Could she really do this? Would this journey bring her closer to her father, or would it only make her feel even more lost? As the sun began to set, she stopped near a small creek to rest. She let Storm drink while she spread the map over a rock, tracing her finger along the path. Her final destination was the Pacific coast, thousands of miles away. But right now, the road ahead felt less intimidating than the emptiness inside her. Taking a deep breath, she pushed her doubts aside. This was just the beginning. She would learn to face the challenges, one day at a time. But as she gazed at the horizon, painted in shades of gold and crimson, Hannah didn't realize she was being watched. Across the road, two men in worn-out cowboy hats exchanged glances and quiet whispers. One of them nodded toward Storm, murmuring something to his companion. Hannah had no idea that her journey was about to take a dangerous turn. Hannah adjusted her hat as the wind picked up, rustling the dry grass around her. She had always loved the quiet of the open road, but something about this evening felt different. Uneasy, as if the air itself carried a warning. Storm flicked his ears back, sensing her tension. He had always been good at picking up on her emotions. Something her father used to say made him more than just a horse. Hannah tried to shake off the feeling, blaming her nerves. It was her first night truly alone, and she needed to stay focused. As she secured her pack and prepared to continue riding, she heard the distant hum of an approaching truck. The headlights appeared on the horizon, growing larger as the vehicle rumbled closer. Hannah stepped to the side of the road, watching as the old, dusty pickup slowed down. Inside, she recognized the two men she had seen earlier in town. They were staring at her at Storm. A lump formed in her throat, but she kept her posture steady. The truck stopped just a few feet away, the engine idling loudly. One of the men, a scruffy-looking guy with a cigarette dangling from his lips, leaned out the window. "That's a fine horse you got there, miss," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made Hannah's skin crawl. The other man, stockier with a deep scar on his cheek, gave her a slow, unsettling smile. "You traveling alone?" he asked. Hannah forced herself to remain calm. "Just passing through," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. She gripped Storm's reins a little tighter, her mind racing. They hadn't done anything yet, but every instinct told her they weren't just being friendly. She glanced at the road ahead. If she could keep moving, maybe they would lose interest. "Well, you be careful now," the scarred man added, his grin never fading. A girl alone with a horse like that might attract the wrong kind of attention. Without another word, Hannah urged Storm forward, her heart pounding. The truck stayed put for a few moments before finally rolling forward, slowly following her. She could feel their eyes on her back, a creeping sensation that made her skin prickle. Storm's ears flicked nervously, and she whispered to him, "Easy, boy, just keep moving." But as she reached a curve in the road, the truck suddenly accelerated, speeding ahead before swerving to a stop, blocking her path. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. They weren't just watching her. They were hunting her. Hannah's breath came in short, sharp bursts as she pulled Storm to a halt, her mind racing. The truck sat squarely in the middle of the road, its headlights blazing like predatory eyes. The two men moved slowly, deliberately, stepping out of the vehicle as if they had rehearsed this moment. The taller one flicked his cigarette into the dirt and smirked. "Now, there ain't no need to be scared," he said, voice slick like oil. "We just want to have a word with you." Storm shifted beneath her, muscles tensing, nostrils flaring. Hannah forced herself to stay calm, though every instinct screamed at her to run. She scanned her surroundings, dense woods on one side, an open field with a barbed wire fence on the other. Neither offered an easy escape, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. The stockier man took a step forward, boots scraping against the gravel. "That's a mighty fine horse you got there," he said, his tone dipping into something darker. "Bet he's worth a good chunk of change." He tilted his head, looking her up and down in a way that made Hannah's skin crawl. "Girl like you, all alone out here? Looks dangerous." His smirk widened. "Maybe you oughta let us take him. Hell, maybe you could use some company, too." Hannah's stomach twisted, but she didn't let her fear show. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the reins, fingers tightening like a vice. "Not interested," she said flatly. Her voice was steady, but her pulse hammered against her ribs. She could see it in their eyes. They weren't planning to just let her go. Then, without warning, she kicked her heels into Storm's sides. "Go, boy," she shouted. Storm reared back with a powerful snort before lunging forward. The taller man cursed and lunged to grab the reins, but Hannah yanked them away just in time. The horse charged toward the truck, his hooves striking the pavement with deafening force. At the last second, Hannah veered him to the right, heading straight for the barbed wire fence. There was no other way. She braced herself as they crashed through, the metal wire scraping against her arm, a sharp sting tearing through her jacket. Pain flared up, but she clenched her jaw and kept riding. Behind her, the men were shouting, their voices laced with anger. The growl of an engine roared to life. Tires spun against the dirt as the truck lurched forward, bouncing over the rough terrain of the open field. Hannah risked a glance over her shoulder, her stomach clenched. They were coming after her. Storm galloped at full speed, but the truck was gaining. Hannah's mind raced. She needed to think fast. The field stretched endlessly ahead, but if she didn't find a way to lose them soon, she wouldn't have a way out. The cold night air burned in Hannah's lungs as Storm charged across the open field, his powerful legs eating up the distance between them and whatever lay ahead. But no matter how fast they went, the truck behind them kept coming. The engine's guttural roar sent shivers down her spine, growing louder, closer. Headlights bounced wildly over the uneven terrain, illuminating dust and debris as the tires tore up the ground. Hannah risked a glance back and immediately regretted it. The two men were still on her tail, their silhouettes framed by the glow of the truck's high beams. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to turn. A sharp crack rang out through the night. Gunshot. Hannah's heart slammed against her ribs as she instinctively ducked low over Storm's neck, gripping the reins with trembling hands. The shot had come from behind, but she didn't dare look to see how close it had been. Were they just trying to scare her, or were they actually trying to hit her? Storm snorted, ears pinned back, his muscles bunching beneath her as if he could sense the danger. "Come on, boy, don't let up," she urged, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Her eyes darted wildly across the landscape, searching for anything that could give her an advantage. That's when she saw it. The land ahead sloped sharply downward, leading to a dry riverbed, its banks steep and lined with jagged rocks. It was at least 10 feet across, maybe more. If Storm could make the jump, they would reach the other side, but if he missed, if his hoofs caught the edge wrong, they could crash hard, maybe even break a leg. And yet, the alternative was worse. The truck wouldn't be able to follow. The men would be forced to stop. It was their only chance. Hannah's heart pounded in her ears as she made her decision. Tightening her grip on the reins, she whispered, "Trust me, boy." Storm's ears flicked back at her voice, but he didn't hesitate. He could feel it too, the sheer, desperate urgency in her body. Hannah leaned forward, holding her breath as they reached the edge. Then, with a surge of strength, Storm launched into the air. For a split second, everything was silent. The wind howled around her, the ground disappeared beneath them, and all she could hear was the rapid thudding of her own heartbeat. Then impact. Storm's front hooves hit the dirt hard, his back legs scrambling for purchase. Hannah gasped, gripping the saddle as he skidded on the loose gravel. For one terrifying moment, she thought they were going to fall. But then, miraculously, Storm found his footing. Behind her, the truck screeched to a halt just before the edge of the ravine, its tires spitting up dust and rocks as the men cursed loudly. One of them slammed his fist against the hood in frustration. But Hannah didn't dare slow down to see what they would do next. She had escaped for now, but she knew deep down, this wasn't over yet. The pounding of Storm's hooves gradually slowed as Hannah finally allowed herself to ease up on the reins. Her arms ached from gripping so tightly, her body sore from the relentless ride. The dry riverbed was now far behind them, and so was the truck. But the fear still clung to her skin, making it hard to breathe. She risked a quick glance over her shoulder. Nothing but darkness stretched behind her. No headlights, no figures. They were gone, at least for now. Storm snorted heavily, his breath coming in sharp bursts, his muscles trembling beneath her. He had given everything he had in that last stretch, and Hannah knew he needed to rest. But stopping felt like a risk. The men could find another way around. Maybe they weren't done hunting her yet. The thought sent a chill through her, one that had nothing to do with the cold desert night. She wasn't safe. Not yet. She kept riding, though at a slower pace, scanning the landscape for shelter. The night was growing colder, the distant hoot of an owl echoing across the plains. Finally, in the faint moonlight, she spotted something. A small cluster of trees near a rocky outcrop. It wasn't much, but it was cover. She guided Storm toward it, her body heavy with exhaustion. As soon as they reached the shelter of the trees, she slid off the saddle, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. Hannah pressed a hand to her ribs, wincing. It was only now, as the adrenaline faded, that she noticed the burning sting along her arm. She rolled up her sleeve, hissing at the sight. Her skin was scraped raw from the barbed wire fence, the wound crusted with dried blood and dirt. Damn it! She needed to clean it, but she had no supplies, no medicine. She clenched her jaw. This was just one more problem she'd have to push through. Storm nudged her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck. She reached up, running a shaky hand along his mane. "You saved my life tonight," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. He had trusted her enough to make that jump, to run when she told him to, and she had trusted him with everything. A lump formed in her throat. What would have happened if they hadn't made it? As exhaustion finally caught up with her, she slid down against a tree, wrapping her arms around her knees. She knew she couldn't stay here long. Dawn would come, and with it, new dangers. But for now, just for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. Hannah tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the headlights bouncing behind her, the men's voices echoing in her ears, the deafening crack of the gunshot. She shivered, despite the warmth still lingering in the air. She wasn't sure if it was the cold or the fear that sent chills through her body. The worst part wasn't even what had happened, it was the not knowing. Were they still looking for her? Were they out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting? Storm stood nearby, ears twitching at every sound. He was exhausted, but he didn't lay down. He was still too alert, too aware of the danger that lurked beyond the trees. Hannah reached out and touched his side, grounding herself in the warmth of his body. "We'll be okay," she whispered, but she wasn't sure if she was trying to reassure him or herself. Her arm throbbed where the barbed wire had cut her, the raw wound stinging with every movement. She needed to clean it, but there was no water nearby, no supplies. Infection was a real risk, and she knew she couldn't afford to get sick out here, alone. "I need to find help." The thought made her stomach twist. After what had just happened, The idea of trusting strangers felt impossible. But she couldn't keep running forever. She forced herself to think. There had been a small town a few miles back, one she had bypassed earlier to avoid attention. Maybe if she kept her head down, she could find a store or a gas station, buy some supplies, and get out before anyone asked too many questions. It was risky, but staying out here, wounded and exposed, felt even worse. As the first faint traces of dawn began to paint the sky in soft grays and blues, Hannah made her decision. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. The men might still be out there, but she had no choice. She had to move. Pulling herself up with a wince, she tightened Storm's saddle, whispering, "One more ride, buddy. Just a little further." With one last glance at the trees, she swung herself onto Storm's back and turned toward the road. The night had been long, but the real danger was far from over. The morning air was crisp as Hannah guided Storm back toward the road, her muscles aching from the long night. She had barely rested, her body stiff from sleeping against the tree, but there was no time to dwell on exhaustion. The cut on her arm burned with every movement, and the dried blood caked to her skin was a stark reminder of how vulnerable she was. "I just need supplies, in and out. No trouble." But she knew trouble had a way of finding her, whether she wanted it or not. The town came into view as she crested a small hill. It wasn't much, just a cluster of old buildings, a diner with a faded sign, a few scattered houses, and a single gas station on the outskirts. It looked quiet, almost sleepy, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. That's either good or very, very bad. If those men had come this way, people might have seen them. But if they were still in town, Hannah swallowed hard. She'd have to be careful. She tied Storm to a post behind the gas station, away from prying eyes, and ran a shaky hand through her tangled hair. Her reflection in the station window startled her. Dust clung to her clothes. Her face was streaked with sweat and dirt, and her eyes looked hollow, darkened by exhaustion and fear. "You look like someone who's been running." Taking a deep breath, she pulled the brim of her hat lower and stepped inside. The store was small, the kind of place that sold gas, snacks, and the bare essentials. A middle-aged woman stood behind the counter, flipping through a newspaper, barely acknowledging Hannah as she entered. "Good." She grabbed a bottle of water first, then scanned the aisles quickly. Gauze, disinfectant, something for the pain. Every move felt like it took too long. She kept her head down, paid in cash, and muttered a quick thank you before stepping outside. She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. So far, so good. But as she rounded the corner of the building to retrieve Storm, her stomach dropped. A black truck sat parked near the diner across the street. It was them. The two men were sitting at an outdoor table, drinking coffee, talking casually, as if they weren't hunting her just hours ago. Hannah's hands went cold. She wasn't safe. Not even close. Hannah's breath caught in her throat as she pressed herself against the wall of the gas station, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. They're here. The two men sat just across the street, relaxed, laughing between sips of coffee, as if they hadn't chased her through the night, as if they weren't carrying a gun in that truck. She forced herself to stay still, her mind racing. If she ran now, they'd see her. If she hesitated too long, she might lose her chance to slip away unnoticed. Storm was still tied up behind the station, hidden from view, but the moment she climbed into the saddle, she'd be exposed. She had to think of something fast. Her eyes flicked toward the road leading out of town, too open. The alley behind the store, too narrow for Storm. Then her gaze landed on an old pickup parked nearby, its bed half full of loose hay. It was facing the opposite direction of the men's truck. If she could slip inside and wait for the driver to leave, it might be her best shot at getting out of town unnoticed. She moved quickly, keeping low as she darted toward Storm. The horse flicked his ears at her approach, sensing her urgency. She ran a soothing hand over his neck, whispering, "Not yet, boy. Stay quiet." Her fingers worked swiftly, loosening the knot on his reins, preparing for a fast getaway if her plan failed. Then, taking a deep breath, she made her way toward the pickup, scanning the gas station for its owner. Inside, an old man stood at the register, counting change in slow, deliberate movements. Hannah's stomach clenched. She didn't have much time. Just as she turned back toward the street, her blood ran cold. The taller man from the diner had risen from his chair, stretching lazily. Then, as if feeling her gaze, he turned. Their eyes met. For a fraction of a second, neither of them moved. Then his expression shifted, recognition, surprise, then something darker. Hannah didn't wait for what came next. She spun on her heel and ran. Hannah's boots pounded against the pavement as she sprinted toward the back of the gas station, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Behind her, she heard the scrape of a chair against concrete, followed by hurried footsteps. They were coming. Her mind screamed at her to move faster, but she could already feel exhaustion creeping into her limbs. She had barely eaten, barely slept. She couldn't outrun them forever. Storm stood where she had left him, ears pricked forward, muscles tense, as if he already knew what was about to happen. Hannah didn't hesitate. She grabbed the reins, shoved her foot into the stirrup, and hauled herself onto the saddle. "Go, boy," she gasped, barely settling in before Storm lurched forward, hoofs kicking up dirt as they shot toward the open road. She heard shouting behind her, angry, desperate, then the roar of an engine. Hannah's stomach twisted as she glanced over her shoulder. The black truck had peeled away from the diner, tires screeching as it swerved onto the road, closing the distance between them. The driver, the man with the scar, leaned forward, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled intensity, while his partner rolled down the window. Hannah's breath hitched. The gun. She veered Storm sharply to the right, heading toward the tree line. If she could get into the woods, they wouldn't be able to follow her in the truck. But they knew that, too. The scarred man floored the gas pedal, trying to cut her off before she reached the trees. She clenched her jaw, urging Storm faster. The ground blurred beneath them, the wind stinging her face. Faster, faster. A loud crack split the air, another gunshot. Hannah ducked instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs. The shot missed, but the sound sent Storm into a full sprint, his powerful legs propelling them forward with raw adrenaline. The trees were so close now, just a few more yards. She could make it. Then suddenly a fence. Hannah's breath caught. A tall, rusted barbed wire fence stretched across the edge of the woods, cutting off her escape. The truck was almost on her. There was no time to think. She had one choice, tightening her grip on the reins. She whispered, "Trust me, boy," and with that she urged Storm to jump. Hannah barely had time to brace herself before Storm's muscles coiled beneath her, his powerful body gathering for the impossible jump. The barbed wire loomed ahead, rusted and menacing, but she didn't let herself hesitate. If they didn't clear it, they wouldn't get a second chance. "Go, boy. We have to make it." With a final push, Storm launched into the air. For a moment, everything was weightless. The world slowed, the wind roared in her ears, and the headlights of the truck behind them seemed frozen in place. Then, with a jarring impact, Storm's hooves slammed into the dirt on the other side. He stumbled, his legs buckling for a terrifying second, but then he found his footing and kept running. Behind her, the truck skidded to a violent stop. Tires screeched, and the men shouted in frustration. The fence was too tall, too strong, they couldn't follow. Hannah dared a look back. The scarred man slammed his hands against the steering wheel, his face twisted in rage, while his partner cursed loudly, kicking at the dirt. They had lost, but Hannah wasn't done yet. She didn't slow, didn't stop. She kept riding deeper into the forest, into safety. It wasn't until the truck's headlights disappeared completely that she finally pulled Storm to a halt. Her chest heaved with breathless relief, her entire body trembling. They were gone. She slid off the saddle, nearly collapsing as her legs gave out beneath her. Storm stood beside her, panting, his flanks slick with sweat. Hannah pressed her forehead against his neck, swallowing the lump in her throat. "We did it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We made it." The night stretched silent around them, broken only by the rustling of leaves. She didn't know what lay ahead, how far she still had to go, or what other dangers might be waiting. But for the first time in days, She felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before: hope. And as the first light of dawn touched the sky, Hannah climbed back into the saddle, turned Storm toward the horizon, and rode forward, toward whatever came next.